December 1944. Leyte Island, the Philippines. The monsoon has turned the battlefield into a swamp of smoke and rain. Inside a shredded canvas tent, dim lanterns swing with every blast. Rainwater runs down the canvas walls, dripping onto stretchers lined in mud. You can hear the thunder mix with the rhythm of artillery. There is no heartbeat monitor here. Only the heartbeat itself, pounding through the chaos. Under the leaking roof, a young woman in a torn white uniform presses gauze against a Marine's chest wound. Her name is Lieutenant Frances Nash, U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Her sleeves are rolled past her elbows, her hair matted with sweat and rain. Beside her, another nurse ties off a plasma bag with trembling fingers. The bag swings from a bamboo pole, improvised, fragile, but working. Every few seconds, the ground shakes. The lamp flickers. Someone shouts, "Incoming!" And everyone ducks, except them. For a moment, lightning flashes through the open flap, revealing their faces. Calm, focused, streaked with mud and blood. Angels, standing ankle-deep in hell. Frances kneels again, wipes her hands on her soaked apron, and reaches for her notebook. A tiny diary wrapped in waxed paper. She writes just 8 words. If we stop, they die. Keep moving. Outside, a stretcher team splashes past, carrying another man from the jungle. Behind them, the silhouette of a hospital ship flickers far offshore, its red cross glowing faintly through the storm. No one in this tent carries a weapon. Only gauze, only plasma, only courage. Before dawn, the shelling will stop. The rain will not. And these women, exhausted, unseen, unforgettable, will have saved dozens who should have died that night. She doesn't know it yet. But this night will make them legends, the angels in hell. By late 1944, the Pacific was on fire again. American forces were returning to the Philippines, island by island, mile by mile, reclaiming ground once lost after the fall of Bataan. But this time, they weren't coming alone. Behind the waves of soldiers, behind the tanks, and the endless supply convoys, came another army. One without rifles. The United States Army Nurse Corps. 50,000 women in uniform, trained not in retreat, but in endurance. Their orders were simple and terrifying. Deploy as near to the front as possible. They came from every corner of America. Farm girls from Iowa, teachers from Ohio, medical students from Boston. They left behind lipstick and laughter for helmets and bandages. Recruitment posters promised adventure. Enlist for victory. Serve beside the brave. But the truth, they would serve inside the war. In training camps across Kansas and Texas, they learned to dig foxholes, to sterilize instruments with field stoves, to give plasma in the dark. They practiced surgery while artillery simulators shook the ground. Some fainted the first week. By the second, they stopped flinching. One instructor told them, "You won't have time to be afraid. You'll be too busy saving lives." By autumn, the troop ships left San Francisco, gray silhouettes sliding into the Pacific mist. Nurses lined the decks, watching the Golden Gate vanish behind them. Their destination? Leyte, Guam, Saipan, and the long road toward Japan. To the Japanese High Command, the idea was unthinkable. In their war doctrine, women stayed home, far from the sound of guns. A captured officer later wrote, "The Americans send women to war. We thought they could not bear it." But they could, and they did. Because in the jungles of the Pacific, the front lines and the hospital lines were about to merge. Shells would fall on medical tents. Airstrikes would hit field wards marked with red crosses. Disease would kill more soldiers than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, dengue. And through all of it, the nurses kept working. Some carried sidearms they would never use. Most carried only morphine and courage. When the first convoys reached Leyte in December, the beaches were already crowded with wreckage. Half-sunken landing craft, broken trucks, crates of medical supplies washed in by the tide. A lieutenant stepped off the gangway and sank to her knees in mud. Her first thought wasn't fear. It was calculation. How fast can we build a ward here? They raised their tents next to the artillery emplacements. They shared rations with the infantry. They slept through shell fire, waking only when someone screamed for help. Later, one of them wrote, "They thought we'd collapse at the sound of gunfire. We learned to work through it." And they did. Through the roar of battle, through the endless rain, through every wounded man who whispered, "Thank you, ma'am," before slipping into silence. They weren't on the front line. The front line had come to them. Night falls again on Leyte. The jungle is soaked. The tents sag under the weight of water. Somewhere beyond the ridge, American artillery answers Japanese guns hidden in the hills. Inside the 38th Field Hospital, Lieutenant Frances Nash moves through the ward, her boots sinking into mud that never dries. Every cot is full. The air smells of iodine, diesel, and fear. She checks the morphine stock. Half gone. Bandages, almost none left. Somewhere outside, a generator coughs, dies, then sputters back to life. Its light wavers like a heartbeat. Then the sound changes. A distant drone, growing louder. The unmistakable rhythm of aircraft engines. "Bombers," someone whispers. Frances looks up. The tent canvas trembles with each passing second. She knows what comes next. The first explosion lands 300 yards away. A thunderclap that flings dust from the rafters. The second hits closer, tearing open the night. The floor heaves. Stretchers slide. Bottles crash. Down. She throws herself over a patient, using her own body as a shield. Around her, nurses crawl beneath cots, pulling canvas over the wounded. Fragments of bamboo poles and splinters rain down. Someone screams. Someone prays. When the shaking stops, half the ward is gone, ripped open like paper. Through the torn wall, moonlight spills over a nightmare. Trees burning in sheets of white fire, crates of plasma shattered in the mud. The enemy planes fade into the distance, but the war stays. Frances wipes blood from her cheek, not her own, and stands. "We keep working," she says. No one argues. The lanterns are shattered. Only 2 flashlights remain, and one of them flickers. The surgeons tie them to bedposts, so their hands are free. The rest of the light comes from memory. Outside, rain begins again, heavy and relentless. It runs through the open roof and onto the tables where they cut and sew. The nurses work by touch. Cloth, skin, thread. Hours pass without measure. Frances feels her own hands trembling, yet steady on instinct. Fear has no place left to live. It's been replaced by rhythm. Clamp, stitch, wipe, move. At some point, a nurse whispers, "How do we even know his blood type?" Frances answers without looking up. By color in the moonlight. Later, she will write it in her diary. Just that line and nothing else. By dawn, the bombing is over. The hospital looks like wreckage stitched together by willpower. But 72 men are still alive who would have died the night before. The medics call it luck. Frances calls it discipline. She steps outside for the first time in 10 hours. Smoke hangs low over the jungle. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle plays taps for the dead. The nurses stand quietly in the rain. Faces gray with exhaustion, uniforms stained beyond washing. One of them starts to laugh. Soft, hysterical, unstoppable. Another joins her. Soon they're all laughing, not from humor, but from disbelief that they're still here. Frances lets the sound wash over her. Then she says, almost to herself, "We're not nurses anymore. We're soldiers who heal." And that night, under fire and flood, Mercy learned how to fight back. They realized mercy itself had become a weapon. By the second day, The wounded came faster than they could count. Trucks rolled up at all hours. Jeeps, half-tracks, even ox carts, each carrying men who'd been hit in the jungle hills. The 38th Field Hospital had been designed for 200 patients. It now held more than 600. Frances Nash moved like a ghost between cots, her voice calm but firm. "Keep the plasma moving. No waste." Her uniform was so soaked in blood and rain that it had lost its color. She paused for a moment outside the tent. The horizon flashed again. Artillery on both sides. Somewhere in that chaos, the line between doctor and soldier had disappeared. A young nurse named Ellen stumbled to her side, whispering, "They said we'd be pulled back. Why aren't we?" Frances smiled faintly. "Because they still need us." A shell screamed overhead, hitting the jungle edge. The ground shuddered. Dirt rained down through the tent flaps. A row of glass IV bottles exploded behind them, splattering blood and saline across the floor. No one even looked up. They just moved faster. Hours blended together. Day and night meant nothing now. When the sun did rise, it revealed a scene no camera ever captured. Hundreds of stretchers under open sky, rows of nurses in steel helmets and muddy boots, their faces streaked with exhaustion. Frances found herself holding a young private's hand. He couldn't have been more than 19. His leg was gone. He looked at her and asked quietly, "Am I going home?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She just squeezed his hand until he slept. Later, she helped bury him at the edge of the clearing. A shallow grave marked with his dog tags and a cross made from tent stakes. No tears. There wasn't time. Another truck was already coming in. That night, rain returned in sheets. The nurses worked by candlelight and flashlight, faces half lit, half shadow. A surgeon called out, "We're out of ether." Frances shouted back, "Then use pressure. Hold him down." In that storm of screams, one nurse began to hum. A quiet tune from home, "You Are My Sunshine." The melody spread from table to table, soft but steady, drowning out fear. For a few seconds, the jungle itself seemed to pause. At dawn, a C-47 transport buzzed overhead, dropping crates of supplies tied to parachutes. The nurses ran through mud to collect them. Bandages, morphine, canned food. One crate shattered open, scattering letters from home across the mud. They floated like pale leaves. Frances knelt to pick one up. It was addressed to "Dear Mom." She folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and went back to work. By the end of the week, they had saved more than 400 men. They had lost count of how many they couldn't. When the official report reached headquarters, it read only, "Casualty sustained, hospital operational." But that line didn't tell the truth. The truth was written in the faces of the women who had stopped being afraid. Fear had turned into ritual. Ritual into instinct. Every nurse now moved with the precision of soldiers. Hands steady, voices sharp, no hesitation. The battlefield had reshaped them. They were no longer bystanders to war. They were the war, fighting it one heartbeat at a time. And as Frances watched another convoy of stretchers vanish into the night, she understood what no manual had ever taught. In this place, mercy was not weakness. Mercy was endurance. Mercy was defiance. They didn't realize it at first. But somewhere between blood and rain, between terror and duty, they had turned compassion into a weapon. By 1944, the United States Army had built something the world had never seen before. A moving, breathing machine of medicine that followed the war wherever it went. It wasn't forged from steel or armor. It was built from canvas, courage, and 80 tons of gear. Each field hospital was a miracle of logistics. Within 36 hours of landing, it could be fully operational. Wards, operating tents, pharmacies, X-ray units, even dental chairs. What began as a patch of mud could become a functioning hospital in less time than it took to build a runway. On Leyte, nurses and engineers worked side by side, hammering poles into soaked ground, rigging canvas roofs with parachute cord. Inside, they laid planks over ammunition crates to make surgical tables. Bamboo became IV poles. Empty gas tins were turned into sterilizers. It was medicine held together by improvisation. And it worked. Every piece of equipment had to arrive by sea, then by truck, then by hand. A single operating table meant 50 supply men, 2 landing ships, and a convoy of trucks that never stopped rolling. And when the wounded came, the entire chain moved in reverse. The evacuation chain, the lifeline of the Pacific War, began with a jeep. From the front, medics lifted men onto stretchers strapped across the hood and fenders. The jeep roared down dirt tracks to a LST, a landing ship tank, where Navy corpsmen carried them aboard under fire. From there, the wounded crossed to offshore hospital ships, floating cities painted white, marked with massive red crosses. Inside, nurses worked in narrow wards that rocked with the sea, performing surgery in motion as shells whistled in the distance. From those ships, the chain stretched across the ocean, to Guam, then Honolulu, then to base hospitals in San Francisco. It was the longest medical network ever built. 10,000 miles of mercy. And it ran on blood. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Transport Command had begun flying 100,000 units of blood plasma every month in C-47 Sky trains. The aircraft flew through storms, carrying crates wrapped in dry ice, each stamped "From home to the front." Sometimes the nurses joked that plasma was the true fuel of the war. Without it, the tanks would stop. In the tropical heat, refrigeration was a battle all its own. With no electricity, they packed crushed ice into ammunition boxes to keep plasma cool. When the ice melted, they poured the water into canteens and started over. The nurses learned to sterilize scalpels using aviation fuel, burning it in tin cups until the metal glowed. It was dangerous, primitive, and life-saving. No one taught them how to build a hospital out of jungle and debris. They learned because they had to. By 1945, this hidden army of healers had saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The U.S. survival rate for the wounded climbed above 90%, the highest of any army in the world. Japan's, by comparison, rarely reached 60. The difference wasn't just medicine. It was movement. The ability to bring healing faster than the enemy could bring harm. Inside one tent on Leyte, Lieutenant Frances Nash wrote in her diary, "They didn't fight the enemy. They fought infection, fever, and time." And that was true. Every bandage, every drop of plasma, every hour without sleep was a battle in itself. They fought against rot, against maggots and wounds, against the monsoon that turned everything to mold. They fought the unseen enemies that waited after the guns went silent. They were not just saving lives. They were rewriting what it meant to wage war. By early 1945, the medical network stretched like an invisible artery across the Pacific. From foxholes on the front line to base hospitals in Honolulu, every wounded soldier followed the same route. A chain designed with precision, speed, and compassion. A young Marine hit on Okinawa could be receiving surgery within an hour, blood transfused within 2, evacuated by sea or air within 6. It wasn't luck. It was engineering. Each link in that system had a name and a heartbeat. At the front, battalion aid stations, a medic's satchel carried everything from sulfa powder to morphine syrettes. These men worked under fire, crawling through mud to reach the wounded. "If he's still breathing, he's worth carrying," they said. Behind them, collecting stations sorted the living from the dead. Triage born in chaos. From there, ambulance jeeps thundered down cratered trails to the nearest field hospital. And that's where the nurses took over. They weren't just nurses anymore. They were surgeons' right hands, anesthetists, logisticians, and morale officers all at once. Every 38th Field Hospital operated like a factory of mercy. Francis Nash's team could set up 6 full wards in under 1 day using tents, bamboo, and crates. Within those wards, order ruled. Charts hung from cot poles, supplies stacked in waterproof tins, labels handwritten in pencil. Each patient had a tag: name, unit, blood type, time of injury. It was the difference between life and death. In the humidity, infection spread faster than bullets. Without refrigeration, medicine spoiled within hours. So they built their own cold storage, metal drums filled with the river ice wrapped in canvas. It wasn't perfect, but it kept plasma alive long enough to save lives. On good days, the C-47s brought more supplies. On bad days, the nurses improvised. When morphine ran out, they mixed alcohol and crushed aspirin to dull the pain. When the sterilizers broke, they poured aviation fuel into trays and set it alight. When gloves tore, they boiled them in water, dried them over lanterns, and used them again. "Necessity made us inventive," Francis wrote later. "We could turn anything into medicine, even fear." And through all this, the statistics began to shift. At the start of the war, the average wounded soldier had a 50-50 chance of survival. By 1945, under the U.S. Army Medical Corps, that number had risen above 90%. Every life saved was a small victory, but together they reshaped the war's arithmetic. In Japan's army, cut off by Allied blockades, medical supplies were scarce. Penicillin was almost unknown. Many Japanese surgeons resorted to whiskey as antiseptic and silk thread for sutures. For every 10 wounded soldiers, only 6 would survive. For the Americans, it was 9. 9 out of 10 who went down came home. It wasn't just better equipment, it was the network. The choreography of movement, the discipline of care. From the moment a soldier hit the ground, invisible hands lifted him. Medic, driver, nurse, doctor, pilot. Each passing him to the next link in a chain of survival. And at the heart of it, always, were the women in white fatigues, sleeves rolled, faces smeared with soot and sweat. They called it field medicine. But really, it was combat logistics. A different kind of warfare fought with needles and gauze instead of bullets. In Francis Nash's tent, time had no meaning. One night, a storm shorted the generator, plunging everything into darkness. She held a flashlight between her teeth while a doctor worked on a shrapnel wound. When it went out, they continued by memory. Clamp, suture, breathe. At dawn, the rain stopped. A beam of sunlight cut through the tent, glinting off steel instruments still warm from the fire. Francis looked around the ward. 70 wounded, all alive. The war outside raged on, but in this corner of mud and blood, they had built order out of chaos. This was not just medicine. It was machinery, a living organism that could move faster than destruction itself. And if the Pacific War had a pulse, it was beating here, in the tents, the trucks, and the trembling hands of the hidden army of healing. In the final months of the Pacific War, the system reached its peak. A perfect intersection of medicine, logistics, and willpower. From the coral beaches of Iwo Jima to the blood-soaked hills of Okinawa, the hidden army of healing worked without pause. Each battle stretched them thinner, but the machine never stopped. Francis Nash and her nurses were now veterans of chaos. They could assemble a full surgical ward in half a day, blindfolded if they had to. They could perform triage by sound, the shallow breathing of the dying, the heavy moan of the living. When the wounded flooded in after Okinawa, every tent overflowed. There was no space left, so they laid men under tarps, in trenches, even under trucks. The smell of antiseptic mixed with diesel, gunpowder, and wet earth. "Don't think, just move," Francis told her team. The mind panics, the hands remember. And the hands did. They built order out of the unthinkable. Nurses tracked every heartbeat with stopwatches, recorded transfusions on scraps of ration paper. The supply sergeants turned jungle trails into conveyor belts of bandages. Even in the face of exhaustion, they found moments of defiance, little rebellions against despair. When a piano was salvaged from a wrecked officers' club, the nurses pushed it into the recovery ward. At night, under blackout covers, someone played Moonlight Serenade. Wounded men wept quietly in the dark, medicine, music, and mercy, all working together to keep the world from breaking completely. Behind the front, engineers and logisticians calculated what every life cost to save. 80 tons of equipment for each field hospital, 10 gallons of plasma a day, 100 crates of medical supplies per week. It wasn't just healing, it was industry. In warehouses on Guam, crates were marked with a simple red circle. Surgical, do not delay. From there, Navy pilots flew them across typhoons, landing on mud runways carved out by Seabees. Sometimes the boxes arrived soaked, warped, or burned. The nurses didn't complain. They fixed what they could, replaced what they couldn't, and carried on. Every movement was measured in seconds, because seconds meant lives. When communications failed, they invented a new system, stringing colored flags between wards to signal the next evacuation wave. Red meant critical, yellow meant stable, green meant ready to move. No one told them to do it. They just did. And when the fighting finally reached Okinawa, the most brutal battle of the Pacific, the hidden army met its ultimate test. 40,000 wounded in less than 2 months. Hospitals built in swamps, under air raids, surrounded by mosquitoes thick as smoke. The nurses wore gas masks during surgery to block the stench of decay. They fought not only infection and fever, but also typhoons that tore through their tents. When lightning hit a supply dump, Frances led a team through the storm to rescue the plasma. "If it melts, they die," she shouted. They formed a human chain, passing each crate hand to hand through the rain, until every last one was safe. That night, someone carved words into a ration box. They didn't fight the enemy. They fought infection, fever, and time. It became the motto of the 38th Field Hospital. By the time Japan surrendered, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had treated more than 1 million casualties across the Pacific. Their survival rate remained above 90%, a number that changed the history of battlefield medicine forever. When the soldiers went home, the nurses packed up their tents, their instruments, and their memories. The war ended quietly for them. No parades, no medals for most. Just silence, and the ache of what they'd seen. But their legacy remained. Every modern combat hospital, every medevac helicopter, every mobile surgical unit that exists today owes its blueprint to the women who turned canvas into hope. They proved that logistics could save lives, that compassion could be engineered, that mercy could move faster than death. Frances Nash would later write, "We didn't win battles with guns. We won them with hands that refused to stop shaking." And as the waves of the Pacific crashed against empty beaches, the echoes of that hidden army lingered. Soft, steady, unbreakable. They were the pulse beneath the war, the proof that even in hell, humanity could still hold the line. By the summer of 1945, the guns were still firing, but something else was winning. Across the Pacific, from New Guinea to Okinawa, over 500,000 wounded men had passed through U.S. Army hospitals. 500,000 lives pulled back from the edge by the hands of women who never fired a shot. 201 of them were decorated with bronze stars and Purple Hearts. 16 were killed in action, but every one of them carried scars, the kind that don't bleed. In the reports, their bravery was measured in numbers. In reality, it was measured in hours without sleep, and shaking hands that refused to stop, and the quiet determination to keep someone else breathing when they could barely stand themselves. General Douglas MacArthur once said, "These women are as vital as ammunition." And he was right. Because without them, the Pacific Campaign would have collapsed, not from enemy fire, but from the sheer weight of human suffering. Okinawa, the last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific. For 77 days, rain and artillery fell without pause. The 38th Field Hospital, under Lieutenant Francis Nash, stood less than 5 miles from the front. When the typhoon hit, it tore through their tents like paper. Lightning split the sky. Rain poured through the ceiling. Mud swallowed the stretchers. But surgery didn't stop. They tied lanterns to tent poles with torn bandages. They worked standing in ankle-deep water, holding flashlights in their mouths to see. For 36 hours, Frances and her team fought to save one Marine, shrapnel in his abdomen, lungs collapsing. The wind howled so loud they couldn't hear the artillery anymore. Every stitch was done by instinct. Every breath of the wounded man felt like a prayer. At dawn, the storm finally broke. The man was still alive. Frances collapsed where she stood. When she woke hours later, she found a note pinned to her uniform. It read simply, "You kept me breathing. That's all that matters." No medal, no headline, just proof. Proof that courage can be quiet. When the war ended in August, the world celebrated victory. But in the hospitals, the nurses didn't cheer. They just kept working. Thousands of wounded soldiers were still fighting a slower war. Disease, infection, memory. And the nurses who had held their hands in combat now held them through recovery. The press called them angels. But they were more than that. They were builders, turning jungle clearings into cities of healing, turning despair into survival. Even Japan's own medical officers, once captured, were astonished. One wrote in his interrogation report, "You turned jungles into cities of healing. You gave medicine the speed of war." Francis Nash never forgot the faces, neither did any of the others. When they boarded ships home, the sea was calm for the first time in years. They stood on deck, staring at the horizon, the Pacific wind drying their tears before they fell. They were no longer the same girls who had left Kansas, Ohio, and New York. They had aged 10 years and 3. They had watched boys die, and they had brought some back. And though their names rarely made the papers, the soldiers never forgot. In letters written home, men described them as the calm in the storm, the sound of hope, the proof that God hadn't left the island. When the casualty lists were read in Washington, most didn't mention the nurses. But among the ranks of the fallen, 16 names stood apart. Women who had died, doing what no one thought they could do. They were buried under crosses, just like the men they had saved. Their graves marked with the same white marble, their uniforms folded the same way, their courage written in the same silence. And for those who came home, another kind of battle began. A quiet war with memory, with nightmares, with the feeling that no one back home could truly understand what they had seen. Some couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of rain on canvas. Some couldn't pass a hospital door without remembering the smell of ether and blood. But when asked if they would do it again, every one of them said yes. "The war is over," Francis Nash wrote on the deck of a hospital ship bound for San Francisco. "But we still hear the wounded calling." The Pacific stretched around her like glass, silent and endless. For the first time in years, there was no sound of guns, only the sea and the distant cry of gulls. Below deck, hundreds of recovering soldiers slept in white bunks lined like dominoes. Some still wore bandages yellowed by salt air. A few reached for nurses' hands as they passed. Small gestures, wordless thanks. Frances walked through the ward one last time. Each face reminded her of a night she had survived. Leyte, Okinawa, Manila. Each scar was a map of where mercy had held the line. She stopped beside one young corporal missing both legs. He looked up, smiled weakly, and said, "Ma'am, you look more tired than me." Frances smiled back, but she didn't answer. When they docked in California, bands played on the pier. Flags waved. The soldiers disembarked first. Heroes of victory. Then came the nurses. No medals gleamed on their chests, only fatigue and quiet pride. Some reporters tried to interview them, but the women shook their heads. "Let the boys have the spotlight," one said. "They earned it." But history would remember differently. Over 500,000 soldiers had been treated in Pacific field hospitals. More than 200 women had been decorated for bravery under fire. 16 had been killed in action. And thousands more had changed the way wars would be fought. Not through killing, but through saving. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone or bronze. It was built into doctrine, into every airlift, every surgical unit, every emergency procedure that would follow for decades. They had proved that discipline and compassion could exist in the same breath. That courage didn't always come from standing tall, but sometimes from staying still. Hands steady, heart unbroken. Years later, when Japanese prisoners of war were questioned about what had surprised them most, one Army doctor answered without hesitation. "Not your weapons, your nurses. You turned jungles into cities of healing. You gave mercy the precision of an army." Even the enemy had seen what the world almost forgot: that the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had done the impossible. They had fought the war's most silent battle, not for ground or glory, but for time itself. Every second they stole from death was a victory. Frances Nash returned home to Kansas in the autumn of 1945. The leaves were turning gold when she stepped off the train. Her parents were there, smaller than she remembered. She hugged them, smiled, and said nothing about the war. For months, she woke at night to the sound of thunder, reaching for morphine she no longer carried. In the quiet, she wrote letters to her fellow nurses scattered across the country. They called themselves the Sisters of Silence. They didn't talk about trauma or medals or fear. They talked about recipes, gardens, the weather. But between the lines, they shared a truth only they could understand: that in the ugliest corners of humanity, they had seen something pure, the will to heal. When she finally returned to nursing in a civilian hospital, Frances was different. She moved slower, but with absolute certainty. When a young intern once asked, "How did you stay calm back there?" she replied, "Because panic never saved anyone." Her answer would echo through generations of nurses who followed. By the late 1940s, military medical schools began teaching field adaptability, a concept born directly from the Pacific War nurses. It emphasized improvisation, speed, and empathy under fire. Their field experience laid the foundation for what would become the MAS*H system in Korea and the mobile surgical units in Vietnam. Modern medevac helicopters, rapid plasma deployment, even triage color codes, all traced back to the women who had once treated soldiers in bamboo tents. They had changed not only medicine, but the idea of what women could endure and command. In 1948, when the U.S. Congress made the Army Nurse Corps a permanent branch of the military, Frances attended the ceremony quietly, standing at the back. When asked why she didn't come forward to be honored, she said simply, "We did our job, that's all." But the generals knew better. To them, these women were proof that courage had many forms. Some louder, some softer, all essential. In the years that followed, the world changed. But the story of the nurses of the Pacific remained a whisper. Photographs yellowed, diaries faded, yet somewhere in every hospital, in the hum of a monitor, in the steady rhythm of a pulse, their legacy still breathes. Because courage doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears white. The war was over. But for the women who had fought it without guns, the echoes never really stopped. In 1946, the ships came home, full of soldiers, medics, and nurses. Crowds cheered as men stepped onto American soil. The nurses followed quietly, walking down the same gangways, carrying the same duffel bags. And memories no one asked about. There were no parades for them, no speeches, no fanfare. Just a train ticket home, a uniform folded neatly in a trunk, and silence. But their story did not end there, because what they had built in the jungles of Leyte and the mud of Okinawa would become the blueprint for modern military medicine. In 1947, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps was made permanent by act of Congress. It became the backbone of post-war humanitarian missions, in Berlin, in Korea, and later under the United Nations flag. Their system of mobile hospitals, refined under fire, inspired the NATO emergency doctrine that would define Cold War readiness. The triage codes, the portable sterilizers, even the concept of forward surgical teams, all traced back to those tents on the Pacific Front. What had begun as survival had become strategy. Yet, at home, many of the women faced a different kind of war. The diaries they left behind tell of nights waking to phantom explosions, of dreams that smelled like iodine and smoke. They returned to hospitals that felt too clean, too quiet. Some stayed in nursing. Some couldn't bear the sound of an ambulance ever again. In one diary, Frances Nash wrote, "The war follows you home. It hides in the sound of rain." For decades, few spoke of what they had done. In an era that celebrated generals and bombers, there was little room for the ones who had stitched humanity back together. But time, as it always does, began to reveal what history had missed. By the 1950s, military doctors began teaching a new doctrine, one rooted not only in efficiency, but in ethics. They called it the humanitarian principle of war. It stated that victory meant nothing if you couldn't save the people who fought for it. That medicine was not charity, it was strategy. And that belief rippled outward, from battlefield hospitals to disaster relief, to peacekeeping, to every humanitarian mission that would follow. When the United Nations deployed its first peacekeeping forces, it modeled their medical operations on the Army Nurse Corps. When NATO built field hospitals during the Cold War, it borrowed their triage methods and logistical flow. And when helicopters began lifting the wounded from the front lines in Korea and Vietnam, the nurses' improvisations in the Pacific, their color-coded tags, their mobile plasma kits, had already written the manual. Their legacy had taken flight. Back in Kansas, Frances Nash retired quietly, keeping a single photo on her dresser. A snapshot from 1944. 5 women in drenched uniforms, smiling through mud and exhaustion. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Angels in Hell." She never spoke of medals. She never called herself a hero. But every time she heard the word nurse, she smiled, as if remembering a secret the world had nearly forgotten. The war they fought was invisible, but its lesson was not. In total war, healing is strategy. Saving lives is not the opposite of victory. It is its measure. These women didn't just tend to the wounded. They changed the tempo of war itself, proving that compassion could move as fast as destruction, that mercy could be organized, that humanity could be built into a supply line, and long after the guns went silent, their spirit lived on. In medics at disaster sites, in doctors on the front lines of epidemics, in every volunteer who runs toward danger instead of away. Because the legacy of the Army nurses of the Pacific wasn't only in the lives they saved. It was in the world they reshaped. A world that finally understood that to heal is to fight for the living. She once wrote, "We carried no weapons, yet we were soldiers all the same." Lieutenant Ruth Parsons, 1945. They stood in the mud instead of the trenches. Their battlefields were hospital wards lit by lanterns and courage. Their enemies were fever, infection, and time itself. 500,000 men came home because of them. 500,000 heartbeats that would have stopped kept going because someone refused to stop working. They proved that strength is not the absence of fear. It is the will to keep healing even when the world is breaking. Their compassion changed the face of military medicine forever. From the jungles of Leyte to every modern field hospital, their hands still guide the ones who save others today. They were the soldiers without rifles, and their victory was life. Subscribe to Battle Records to uncover more untold stories of courage, invention, and humanity in World War II.